You've been told the world is a story of order, of progress, of morality. But what if everything you believed was a carefully constructed illusion? Tonight, I'm going to pull back the veil. I'm going to take you to the edges of history and into the shadows where the powerful whisper truths you were never meant to hear. This isn't a story for the faint of heart. It's a tale of warning, of prophecy ignored, of danger unseen until it was too late. Imagine a woman, her voice clear, her warnings precise, yet dismissed. She saw the currents of deception twisting through the corridors of power, yet no one listened. And in that silence, darkness grew. This is the story of the invisible architecture of control, the way elites, institutions, and hidden forces manipulate, exploit, and reshape reality while the masses sleep. They are masters of perception, architects of fear. And what she knew, what she saw, was more terrifying than anyone could imagine. But it isn't just history. It's a reflection of the world you walk through every day. Every handshake, every headline, every law is a thread in a tapestry you weren't invited to see. She warned them about him. He, a man who would rise with charm and menace intertwined, who would bend the systems around him, who would make fear invisible and submission inevitable. She saw his patterns long before the world did, long before headlines screamed, long before the inevitable chaos. And yet, warnings fell on deaf ears. It's easy to laugh at those who sense danger before it arrives. It's easy to dismiss intuition when it doesn't fit your narrative of reality. But she knew, because she had glimpsed the machinery beneath the surface. And what I'm about to show you is that this machinery never sleeps. It has a rhythm, a history, and a purpose. And those who ignore the warnings, well, they are consumed first. Tonight, you are stepping into that machinery. You are watching what the world hides from itself. You are standing at the edge of knowledge that can change everything, if you are brave enough to hold it. Every word you hear, every detail you digest, will shift the lens through which you see humanity, morality, and power itself. This is your invitation. Not for comfort, not for reassurance, but for awakening. They remembered her only as the woman who spoke too softly, too carefully, as if every word carried weight she was terrified to release. But those who paid attention, those rare few, noticed something else hidden behind her eyes. The look of someone who had seen the pattern before. She didn't warn them out of fear. She warned them out of certainty. And certainty is far more dangerous. She told them, watch him, not for what he does in the light, but for how the shadows react when he walks by. They laughed, of course. People always laugh when warnings feel inconvenient. But she was unmoved. She described him as if describing a storm in human form, something ancient, deliberate, grinding forward with a purpose no one dared articulate. And her voice carried that unnatural stillness, the kind that comes only from witnessing something powerful enough to rewrite the fate of entire rooms without ever raising its voice. The first signs were small, too small for the untrained to recognize. A shift in hierarchy without any announcement. A decision approved before anyone claimed to make it. A tension growing in the air when he entered a space, as if everyone's instincts recoiled before their minds caught up. He didn't speak of influence. He didn't display authority. He existed with it, like a gravitational pull altering the orbit of everyone around him. She recognized this type of presence from the forbidden text she once studied, records documenting individuals who didn't seize power, but radiated it. Men who operated in the blind spot of perception. Men whose control was felt before it was understood. She knew the cost of ignoring such a man. History had carved that warning into the bones of civilizations. But history is only valuable to those who believe it can repeat. She tried again and again to be heard. She told them he could make institutions bend without issuing a command, that he could generate loyalty without promising reward, that he could fracture unity without lifting a hand, and that the greatest monsters often enter quietly, never needing to roar. But every warning brought her closer to exile. People avoid truth-tellers because truth corrodes illusions they depend on. And so they silenced her, not with force, but with dismissal. They didn't realize that when a warning is ignored, it becomes prophecy. And when a prophecy is ignored, it becomes fate. And he, silent, calculating, patient, was already weaving his way through the blind spots of their comfort. Her words were the last echo of protection they would ever receive, and they let it fade. Let me be clear, this isn't just a story about one man or one woman. This is a story about the structures that allow men like him to rise, and the blindness that allows the rest to follow. She understood it. That was her edge. She knew the rules were written not in laws, not in policies, but in subtle manipulations, invisible levers of influence that most people never notice until it's too late. And he was a master of them. She saw the way he studied rooms, noting the smallest reactions, the hesitation before a word, the twitch in a shoulder. To him, people were instruments, not companions. And the tragedy was that no one else noticed. No one else saw the strings he was pulling, the way he could bend perception so completely that reality itself seemed to obey him. She tried to articulate it. She tried to give names to the unseen forces he controlled. Fear disguised as respect, loyalty bought with illusions, obedience extracted through subtle intimidation. She mapped out the psychology of it, the rhythm, the patterns repeated over centuries. She spoke of ancient lessons, suppressed truths from the texts the powerful buried, because they understood that knowledge is control. Whoever controls what is known, controls the narrative. Whoever controls the narrative, controls the people. And that's when the danger became personal. She realized that he had already noticed her, though she could not yet prove it. He measured her influence, calculated her reach, and in that calculation, she became a threat. Her warnings, though ignored by the masses, could undo him if she ever found a way to broadcast them loud enough. And men like him never forgive threats. They don't eliminate obstacles. They erase them, slowly, invisibly, so no one realizes it until the damage is permanent. She began to understand what many cannot, that evil is rarely loud. It doesn't need to scream or fight. It only needs patience, intelligence, and invisibility. And those who cannot see it until it strikes are the ones who pay the highest price. And yet, she did not flee. She did not crumble. She became more precise, more relentless, because she understood the stakes. Her voice, though unheard, carried the weight of inevitability. And tonight, I want you to hear it. Because what she knew about him, what she saw in the dark currents of his mind, is what most will never comprehend until it is far too late. The world dismissed her warnings. But you are listening. And that makes all the difference. The first fracture he exploited was the one no one ever thinks to guard, the subtle hunger inside every man to feel chosen, important, elevated above the rest. He didn't offer power outright. No, that would have revealed intent. Instead, he offered the suggestion of significance, a glance that lingered half a second longer than necessary, a nod that implied recognition, a carefully timed silence that made the listener lean in, hoping for approval that never came but always felt within reach. That's how control begins, not with domination, but with the promise of being seen. She watched him perform this pattern with precision. He didn't seek the strongest men. He sought the most insecure, the ones who hid their doubts behind bravado, the ones who craved mentorship but lacked discernment. He offered them something priceless, the illusion that they mattered. And from that illusion, he could extract anything he wanted. Loyalty, silence, compliance, even betrayal. What no one realized was that he had studied human weakness the way an architect studies materials. He knew exactly where the cracks were, exactly how much pressure each person could withstand before breaking. While everyone else judged character by words, he judged by vulnerabilities. And she could see him doing it, subtle, invisible, yet undeniable. Once you recognize those patterns, you can't unsee them. Every handshake becomes a negotiation. Every smile becomes a test. Every compliment becomes a hook. But the most disturbing part, he never lied. Not technically. Men like him don't need lies. They manipulate with truth, selective, sharpened, leveraged truth. He would speak a sentence containing 90% reality and 10% intentional omission. And that 10% was enough to steer entire decisions. That's the kind of mastery that terrifies anyone who understands power. She tried to expose it, carefully, methodically. She documented behaviors, tracked conversations, mapped connections. She presented her findings to the people she hoped would care. But institutions do not protect against internal threats. They absorb them. They normalize them. They convince themselves that danger is inconvenient, not imminent. And so they minimize the warnings, rationalize the red flags, dismiss the intuition that could have saved them. All the while, he grew stronger. The room began leaning toward him without realizing it. Opinions shifted to matches. Doubts evaporated. Decisions that once required debate now passed in silence. And in that silence, she felt the ancient chill of understanding. The machinery was no longer resisting him. It was adapting to him. And she knew this was only the beginning. By the time anyone realized the depth of his influence, it was already too late. Institutions aren't destroyed in a day. They erode silently, like ice melting from within. She had been screaming into that void for months, pointing to the fractures he had planted, the subtle coercions he had embedded, the alliances he had manipulated in ways no one could trace. But warnings are useless when the listener's mind refuses to see. And people always refuse to see until the consequences land like a hammer. He didn't move in chaos. He moved like a shadow across chessboards, positioning pieces while the players thought they were choosing their moves. Every favor he granted was an investment. Every reprimand carefully calculated. Every friendship cultivated as though it were a strategy. Every enemy made as though it were a lesson. And she, being aware, being vigilant, was an anomaly, a glitch in his otherwise flawless algorithm of influence. That's why he noticed her, quietly, with a predator's patience. She began to understand the rules of engagement. To survive, she couldn't attack him outright. That would have been foolish. Instead, she learned the art of containment, observing, documenting, predicting. Every step he took, every smile he offered, every subtle shift of power, she recorded. Because even if the world refused to acknowledge it, she had to remember. She had to preserve the truth. And the truth was far darker than anyone imagined. For his ambition wasn't just personal. It was systemic. He understood that fear, once institutionalized, becomes invisible. He knew that humans obey patterns, not commands. He learned that by controlling perception, he could control behavior. People followed him not because they agreed, not because they trusted, but because he made them doubt their own instincts, their own reality, their own judgment. That is power more ancient than armies, more enduring than wealth. It is the kind of force that leaves no visible scars, only invisible ones. She tried again to warn them, offering precise predictions, pointing to the dominoes lined up to fall. "Watch this," she would say. "This is how he will move next, and here's what will break." And they laughed. They dismissed her as paranoid. They called her warnings inconvenient, disruptive, unnecessary. And in that dismissal, she realized something terrifying. Humanity is not saved by reason, only by awareness. And awareness is rare. By the time the first domino fell, the pattern had already multiplied. She had seen it coming, but no one else had. And that is how history is written, by those who act, and by those who ignored the warning signs until it was too late. The first irreversible consequences didn't announce themselves with fireworks or sirens. They whispered. Subtle shifts at first, budgets approved that made no sense, decisions that bypassed logic, promotions given to the wrong people. Small victories for him, small confusions for everyone else. But these were not mistakes, they were fingerprints. And she, watching from the margins, recognized the pattern. Each domino falling silently, invisibly, building toward a collapse no one yet imagined. She understood something most never grasped. The real danger isn't always visible. It is psychological. It's the erosion of certainty, the subtle rewriting of perception so that people begin to doubt themselves more than they doubt the manipulator. He didn't have to threaten. He didn't have to coerce. People, conditioned by fear, ambition, or habit, surrendered willingly. And the world, trained to ignore intuition and reward obedience, cheered him on unknowingly. She tried to intervene again. She presented data. She predicted the next moves. She named the patterns with clinical precision. But institutions are built to resist change, even when the change saves them. People are built to resist discomfort, even when it screams danger. And so her words were dismissed, rationalized away, buried under polite nods and the invisible weight of conformity. Meanwhile, he moved faster than they could perceive. What the human eye missed, the mind had already recorded. He was orchestrating influence like a composer with a symphony, each gesture calculated to elicit loyalty, fear, admiration, or doubt. Every handshake, every smile, every pause carried significance. And the more people ignored her warnings, the more perfect his architecture of control became. Then came the first real fractures, relationships strained, decisions skewed, alliances broken. People who thought they were independent began acting in concert with his hidden designs. They were his instruments, and they didn't even know it. She tried to stop it, warning that the cost would be measured not in days, but in months and years. But no one listened. They still couldn't see what was unfolding in plain sight. And that is when she understood the truth she had feared most. Sometimes, the world refuses to protect itself, even when given the exact tools to do so. Sometimes, the only way to survive is to watch, to record, to prepare for a reckoning that others will never anticipate until it crashes down on them like a storm. Because once these patterns set, they do not undo themselves. The first casualties were not headlines, not dramatic collapses, but quiet, almost imperceptible. Careers ended suddenly, reputations tarnished overnight, friendships dissolved without explanation. She watched as men and women, proud and confident, became anxious, hesitant, and divided. They did not see the hand guiding their unraveling, and in that blindness lay the true horror. The victim does not recognize the manipulator until the damage is complete. She tried to reach them individually, one by one, but the machinery he had constructed moved faster than intervention. Even those who had once been close to her began to absorb the influence she had warned against. He didn't need to speak to them directly. A look, a subtle suggestion, a planted rumor was enough. People carried out his will thinking it was their own. That is the most insidious form of control, when autonomy becomes a weapon against itself. And yet, in that chaos, she remained steady. She documented everything, the patterns, the triggers, the outcomes. She mapped the psychological control like a cartographer tracing invisible rivers. What she saw was terrifying in its precision. Each domino was connected, each fracture predictable, each collapse inevitable once the first pieces had fallen. And she knew that what most people called coincidence was really the signature of design. The warning she had issued about him, about the way he could twist reality without ever raising his voice, was no longer theoretical. It was unfolding in real time. Men who had been leaders found themselves questioning decisions they had made the week before. Women who had been confidants began to doubt their instincts. Entire teams began to fracture, not from conflict, but from the invisible pressure of alignment he exerted. People began to obey without realizing why, to fear without knowing what, to act against themselves while thinking they were free. She had warned them, once he was embedded in the system, once the first fractures appeared, resistance would be almost impossible. And she was right. By the time anyone noticed the full scope of his influence, they were already complicit in their own subjugation. And the worst part, they would never admit it, because the human ego cannot reconcile awareness with shame until the consequences are irreversible. And that is what made her warning so urgent, so dangerous, and so ignored. Most people cannot handle the truth about power until it hits them personally. And by then, it is far too late. What made his rise so terrifying wasn't speed. It was subtlety. Influence that arrives quickly causes alarm. Influence that seeps in quietly becomes the new normal. And by this point, his presence had become a gravitational constant. People aligned with him without thinking. Policies shifted without question. Entire groups adopted new beliefs without realizing they had abandoned their old ones. It wasn't hypnosis. It wasn't magic. It was the psychology of power, weaponized with precision. She knew the pattern because she had seen it before, years earlier, in a case buried so deeply behind institutional walls that most believed it was myth. A man with the same aura of inevitability, the same ability to bend systems around his silhouette. And as she compared the past to the present, a sickening truth unfolded. Men like him don't appear randomly. They emerge at moments of collective weakness, when people crave direction more than truth, when institutions hunger for order more than integrity. It is in these conditions that the most dangerous individuals thrive, because they are not offering hope, they are offering gravity. And everything falls toward gravity. She watched it happening again, step by step. Conversations grew more guarded. People second-guessed their own thoughts. It wasn't fear of him directly. It was fear of being on the wrong side of perception. That is how deep manipulation works, not by attacking individuals, but by altering the environment around them until their instincts betray them. And yet, he remained calm, patient, almost gentle. That was the worst part. He didn't need brutality. He relied on psychological architecture. You could sit across from him and feel perfectly safe, unaware that your mind was rearranging itself just to appease him. She had felt that force once, and it terrified her, not because she fell for it, but because she felt how easily she could have, had she not known what she was looking at. But knowledge didn't protect her socially. The more she warned them, the more isolated she became. They whispered about her now, questioning her motives, her sanity, her intentions. And she recognized that too, when the manipulator becomes the center of gravity, the truth-teller becomes the threat. People defend the system that imprisons them before they defend the person trying to free them. She wasn't fighting just him anymore. She was fighting the environment he had engineered. And environments don't lose arguments. They consume those who oppose them. Still, she did not stop. Because if she stopped, the fall would be complete, and no one would ever understand what truly happened. The turning point arrived quietly, like all catastrophic shifts do. A meeting, routine, unremarkable on the surface, became the stage where she finally saw the full extent of his power. Not the loud kind. Not authority, not influence, but something far more dangerous, submission without awareness. As people spoke, their words bent subtly toward what they assumed he wanted to hear. Not because he demanded it, but because they feared the discomfort of opposing a force they didn't fully understand. She watched their faces, the flickers of hesitation, the quick glances toward him, the edits in their speech mid-sentence. That's when she felt it, a tightening in her chest, the instinctual realization that they were no longer speaking freely. They were calibrating themselves to him, adjusting tone, tempering conviction, reshaping their thoughts to align with an expectation he never voiced out loud. That is the purest form of control, the kind where the puppets don't realize there are strings. He sat there, calm, polite, almost passive. But every nod he offered, every moment of eye contact, carried weight. Approval from him landed like validation from something larger than the room, something they couldn't name but desperately sought. And she saw it clearly. They had already surrendered pieces of themselves. Identity, integrity, autonomy, all drifting toward him like filings pulled to a magnet. She tried to disrupt it. She spoke with clarity, grounding her arguments in facts, evidence, logic. But logic has no power in a room where perception has already been hijacked. Her words barely made contact. They slid off the surface of their minds like raindrops off glass. And when she finished, he simply smiled, a small, knowing expression that confirmed everything she feared. That smile wasn't victory. It wasn't arrogance. It was acknowledgement. He knew she understood him, and he knew the others did not. That was the moment she realized the stakes had evolved. She wasn't just fighting to reveal him. She was fighting to preserve the sanity of those around her, to keep them from dissolving into the psychological orbit he had created. But saving people who do not know they are in danger is the hardest battle a human can fight. You become the enemy for trying. When the meeting ended, the room dispersed with quiet obedience. And he lingered, watching her. Not threatening, not speaking, just observing her with the cold recognition of a man who had identified his only real adversary. And she understood, the conflict between them was no longer theoretical. It had begun, and only one of them would walk away unchanged. After that meeting, she realized something most never grasp. Influence is invisible, but its effects are unmistakable. People left that room behaving differently, thinking differently, questioning themselves in ways they had never done before. The machinery he had built didn't need to show its teeth. It only needed to shift the ground beneath them so subtly that they believed the tremors were their own doubts. And the tragedy is that no one outside that room would ever understand what had happened. They would see the results, but they would not see the method. She began to map it, tracing every psychological maneuver he employed, every pause in conversation, every phrase that implied choice while offering none, every micro-expression that triggered a reaction. What she saw was terrifying in its elegance. This was not the crude manipulation of fear or intimidation. This was mastery over perception. He could bend the room without saying a word, without issuing a command, without lifting a hand. And once perception bends, reality itself begins to conform. She remembered her own training, the lessons she had studied from forbidden texts, from the histories of men who moved like shadows across empires. These were not myths. These were blueprints. And he was executing them flawlessly. The realization hit her. This wasn't about personal ambition anymore. This was about control over minds, over decisions, over entire systems of influence. And yet, he was patient. That is the terrifying part. He didn't rush. He didn't need to. Those who underestimate patience never survive it. Every gesture, every word, Every silence was calculated to last, sometimes years, sometimes decades, because true power does not demand haste. It only demands consistency. And she saw it in him, a consistency that no argument, no warning, no moral appeal could disrupt. She also knew her position was precarious. Every revelation she documented, every warning she attempted to voice, drew attention, not from the masses, but from him. And men like him recognize truth-tellers before anyone else does. They don't confront you immediately. They observe, measure, wait. And once they decide you are a threat, they act, silently, invisibly, irreversibly. Her warnings had become dangerous, not because he feared exposure, but because she represented the possibility of resistance. And resistance is the one thing he could not tolerate, even if it seemed insignificant to others. From that point forward, nothing would ever be the same. Not for her, not for the people around her, and not for the world he was quietly reshaping, one unseen step at a time. The most chilling part wasn't his skill in manipulating individuals, it was the network forming around him, quietly, organically, almost imperceptibly. She watched as people who once stood independently began orbiting him, aligning their ambitions with his movements, adjusting their decisions to match his patterns. None of them admitted it. None of them even realized it. Influence this deep doesn't feel like pressure. It feels like choice. But she saw the truth. She always had. He wasn't building alliances. He was building dependencies. And dependencies, once formed, are nearly impossible to sever. The first layer of his network consisted of those who admired him. They were drawn to his confidence, his composure, the way he seemed untouched by uncertainty. These men became his echo chamber, reinforcing his presence, amplifying his reach. They praised him publicly, defended him privately, and rationalized his actions even when they didn't understand them. The second layer was more dangerous, the opportunists. These were the ones who sensed his rising influence and tethered themselves to him out of ambition. They didn't care about morality or truth. They cared about proximity. Proximity to power. Proximity to advantage. Proximity to a man who made them feel, without ever promising it, that aligning with him would shape their future. And then there was the third layer, the silent ones. These were the people who didn't support him, didn't oppose him, but adjusted their behavior just enough to avoid friction. They didn't want visibility. They wanted safety. What they didn't realize was that by adapting to him, they were feeding the system he constructed. Compliance doesn't require conviction, only fear of consequences. She was the only one who saw all three layers forming simultaneously, operating in harmony like gears inside an ancient mechanism. And she knew, with a sinking heaviness in her chest, that once networks like this solidify, they become self-sustaining. He didn't need to push anymore. The network would push for him. The machine would maintain itself. Her warnings grew sharper, more urgent. She connected the dots no one else could see. The subtle communications, the shifts in loyalty, the quiet restructuring of authority. She tried to show them that this wasn't charisma, wasn't leadership, wasn't vision. This was infiltration. Psychological. Systemic. Inevitable. But institutions feared disruption more than corruption. And so they ignored her, silenced her, pushed her aside as if she were the problem, not the shield. She watched, powerless, as his network expanded like roots beneath a forest, unseen, unstoppable, preparing to choke everything it touched. And she knew the next phase was coming. The phase no one ever believes in until it is far too late. The next phase was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet devastating. He began shaping not just people, but decisions, policies, projects, even the narratives that others believed were spontaneous. He didn't dictate. He engineered perception. People thought they were acting freely, making choices, weighing consequences. But every option had already been calculated, every path preordained. She recognized it immediately. The invisible architecture of control was now operational. She watched as loyalty and obedience became indistinguishable from personal initiative. People defended his decisions fiercely, convinced they were defending themselves, their teams, their values. And when they faltered, they blamed themselves, never him. That was the brilliance and the horror of his method. No one felt coerced, yet everyone acted under his will. It was psychological slavery wrapped in the illusion of freedom. She tried to warn them again, documenting evidence, drawing lines between cause and effect, mapping the subtle ways he altered reality around him. She explained how networks were designed to reinforce compliance, how subtle praise could generate devotion, and how quiet exclusion could enforce conformity faster than any rule or law. And when she presented her findings, people recoiled, not at him, but at her. She had become inconvenient, a mirror they refused to look into. Meanwhile, he observed, always observing. Every micro-reaction, every hesitation, every expression of doubt was logged in his mind, calculated for future leverage. He didn't need to act violently or overtly. The people around him were already his instruments. And the more she spoke, the more she realized that he had already turned attention into a weapon, silence into compliance, and perception into control. She understood the mechanism because she had studied it for years. The ancient texts, the suppressed case histories, the psychological experiments they never published, all pointed to this same formula. Influence is not chaos. Influence is precision. And once it reaches a certain level, it becomes unstoppable, not because it is loud, but because it is invisible. And in that invisibility lay the most terrifying truth. Most people will never understand they are being manipulated. They will not recognize the danger until it has consumed their choices, their identity, their world. And by then, the only thing left is regret, and the faint memory of a warning they never listened to. She had warned them. They had ignored her. And now, the machine was running on its own momentum. The consequences, when they finally became visible, were subtle enough that most dismissed them as coincidence. But she knew better. A team once productive now argued over trivialities. Projects stalled for no logical reason. Decisions that should have been unanimous fragmented into confusion. And in every instance, he was present, silent, observing, not participating, not speaking, not even seeming to influence. Yet his fingerprints were everywhere. That is the true power of someone like him. He can orchestrate chaos without ever lifting a hand. She began tracking the breakdowns, connecting each thread like a forensic investigator. What emerged was terrifying in its clarity. Every fracture, every conflict, every inexplicable failure traced back to a single catalyst. Not a person's incompetence, not a market shift, not chance, but the subtle recalibration of human behavior around a presence that no one fully understood. And when she tried to explain it, she faced disbelief, hostility, even mockery. People are conditioned to rationalize failure, to assign blame elsewhere, to avoid the uncomfortable truth that someone could manipulate them without ever raising a voice. He had already anticipated this. That was part of the architecture. By the time the fractures became noticeable, they were self-reinforcing. Loyalty solidified around him. Doubts turned inward, toward the victims of his influence. And she watched the human cost accumulate silently. Careers ended. Ambitions were crushed. Friendships decayed. People blamed themselves for faltering under pressure they never knew existed. They didn't realize that the system had been designed to make them fail. She understood that the world was not merely ignoring him. It was becoming his instrument. Every dismissal, every rationalization, every act of inattention strengthened his control. And the terrifying part was that this was intentional, whether consciously or instinctively. Men like him feed on neglect, thrive on complacency, and grow stronger when others refuse to acknowledge the patterns. And so she watched, documenting the collapse in real time, powerless to stop it. Not because she lacked insight or courage, but because the machinery he had activated operated in a space beyond conventional resistance. It was a system that rewrote reality from within, using the very people who believed they were free as its agents. The tragedy of her foresight was that warning people is never enough. Recognition does not equal action, and by the time most people see the truth, the consequences are irreversible. She once believed that influence required intention, words spoken, decisions enforced, strategies crafted with purpose. But with him, nothing was deliberate in the ordinary sense. His power wasn't verbal, political, or even intellectual. It was psychological, subterranean, the kind of influence that doesn't push or pull, but rearranges the internal geometry of the people around him. And the terrifying part was how quietly it happened. People didn't change overnight. They shifted by degrees, the way a shadow lengthens so slowly you don't notice until the room has gone dark. She'd watch colleagues begin to mirror his silences, adopting his stillness as if it were a virtue. They started second-guessing themselves, not because he corrected them, but because his silent gaze made them feel perpetually evaluated. The human mind is a fragile thing. It can endure noise, chaos, even cruelty. But silence? Silence can carve people open. Silence can reshape a person from the inside out. Soon, individuals who once led confidently began to defer to him without ever being told to. They paused mid-sentence to check his expression, as if seeking permission they never consciously requested. Even their language changed. Strong opinions softened. Certainty dissolved. People became pliable, careful, overly aware of the invisible boundaries he projected simply by existing. And those who resisted felt something worse. An unspoken pressure. A psychological weight that made them feel exposed, irrational, even paranoid. They'd leave meetings shaken, unsure why a room with one man sitting silently felt more suffocating than a room full of people shouting. That was his brilliance. He never needed to win arguments. He simply made others unwilling to oppose him. She recognized the pattern too late. Influence, she realized, wasn't about force. It was about atmosphere. It was about creating a space where people either aligned with him or slowly eroded under the stress of resisting. And once the environment tilts in favor of someone like him, it becomes nearly impossible to restore balance. People stop thinking independently. They become extensions of a presence they can't define, let alone fight. And by then, the transformation is almost complete. Because psychological control doesn't announce itself. It whispers. It infects. And by the time you hear the echo of your own thoughts changing, the origin of the shift is already buried too deep to uproot. By the time she pieced together what he truly was, the damage had already sunk its hooks into everyone around him. It wasn't corruption in the typical sense. No bribes, no threats, no paper trail. His influence moved in ways no policy manual could identify, no investigation could quantify, and no whistleblower could articulate without sounding unhinged. She learned something frightening about human nature while watching him. People don't need proof to follow someone. They only need pressure. Not force. Pressure. And he radiated it. It wasn't physical, or emotional, or even psychological in the traditional sense. It was ambient. A field. A distortion in the social fabric that destabilized anyone who came too close. She noticed that people who met him walked away unsettled, though none could explain why. They'd shake their heads, laugh awkwardly, and try to rationalize the unease. But the tension always returned, and slowly, it rewired them. At first, she thought it was intimidation. But intimidation requires intent. He didn't intimidate people, he revealed them. Something in his presence stripped away the protective illusions people used to anchor their identity. You didn't feel small because he made you small. You felt small because you saw, maybe for the first time, the parts of yourself you'd been hiding from. And who wants to confront that? Who wants to look into the mirror of someone who sees everything you're afraid to admit? So rather than face themselves, most people did. The easier thing. They deferred to him. They obeyed him. They surrendered to him. Not because he demanded loyalty, but because saving him felt safer than confronting the truth he exposed. She watched strong men shrink. Confident men hesitate. Leaders apologize for things they didn't do. People who once commanded rooms now stood in doorways, unsure whether to enter. His presence made them question their instincts, their worth, their direction. And once a man doubts himself, you no longer need to control him. He will dismantle himself for you. That was the secret she wished she could force them to understand. He didn't conquer people. He hollowed them out. He made space inside them, and then occupied it. And the worst part wasn't what he did to others. It was what he awakened in her. Something old. Something dangerous. Something she had buried for years, but felt rising again in his shadow. She wasn't just observing him anymore. She was becoming aware. Her awareness was a double-edged blade. The more she saw, the more isolated she became. No one else perceived the invisible currents he created, the subtle shifts in behavior, the silent restructuring of loyalty. They laughed at her cautions, called her paranoid, or worse, they whispered that she was trying to manipulate them. And she realized, with grim clarity, that truth is often indistinguishable from threat when the masses are blind. But she didn't stop. She could not. Every instinct told her that understanding him was not enough. She needed to map him, anticipate him, predict him. To survive, she had to think like him, see the world through his lens, feel the subtle pull he exerted, and yet resist it. And so she began her descent, not into fear, but into comprehension, into the cold mechanics of his influence, the hidden gears of his power, the invisible levers that bent people without ever being touched. She documented each gesture, each pattern, each micromoment of psychological domination, because she understood what most never do. Knowledge is survival, awareness is armor, and silence is the greatest weapon. She also began to notice the small details no one else cared to observe, the way he subtly reinforced dependency, offering guidance that seemed optional but was structurally necessary, the way he created social pressure not by threat, but by expectation, by suggestion, by making people doubt themselves so completely that obedience became unconscious, the way he engineered environments where resistance felt irrational, even immoral. And she understood another terrifying truth: these were not mistakes. These were lessons in power, repeated across centuries, refined and perfected. Men like him did not emerge by chance. They emerged by design, and those who fail to recognize the design are doomed to repeat the collapse. Her warnings became internalized, sharpened into clarity. She began to see the system as it truly was, not a collection of individuals, but a living network of influence, perception, and silent compliance. And in seeing it, she realized something that chilled her to the bone. The moment of reckoning would not come from his actions. It would come from their inaction, because the machine does not stop. It only grows stronger when ignored. And by the time people understood what had happened, the question would no longer be how to resist. It would be how to survive. Those who tried to oppose him quickly discovered the invisible trap. Resistance was not met with confrontation. It was met with erasure. Subtle, imperceptible, and devastating. Careers ended without explanation. Relationships strained and broke. Opportunities vanished. And the victims blamed themselves, never seeing the true source, the silent, patient, unrelenting gravity of a man who had learned to bend perception itself. She observed men who had once been confident crumble under pressure that didn't exist in any measurable form. Women who had led with clarity began to second-guess every instinct. Decisions once guided by experience and reason dissolved into paralysis. And all of it traced back to him, not by force, but by design. He understood an essential truth about control. People fear what they cannot define. And what they cannot define, they rationalize, ignore, or internalize as personal failure. Every act of resistance, every moment of dissent, only strengthened his architecture of dominance. Opponents unwittingly became allies, because they adapted to survive. Compliance doesn't need encouragement, it needs invisibility, the absence of choice disguised as safety. She documented each collapse, each subtle capitulation, and the patterns became undeniable. This was not charisma. This was not natural leadership. This was orchestration. And the most terrifying realization of all, he did not need the majority to succeed. Influence is not measured by numbers. It is measured by the fragility of those who stand against you. A handful of key players can tip the scales if properly aligned. And he had aligned them, invisibly, irreversibly. She knew she had to act differently. She could not confront him the way others tried. Direct opposition would only isolate her further, make her a cautionary tale for the very people she sought to save. No, she had to fight smarter. She had to predict him, anticipate every silent maneuver, understand the architecture of fear and loyalty he had created. And more than anything, she had to resist becoming like him, cold, calculating, patient, and merciless. But resisting someone who reshapes reality around you is exhausting. It erodes certainty, clarity, and confidence. It tests your mind in ways most people cannot survive. And she realized, with a chilling clarity, that even her vigilance might not be enough to stop the consequences already set in motion. Because the moment someone like him embeds himself in a system, the damage is no longer reversible. It only accumulates. By now, the effects of his presence had spread far beyond individuals. Institutions themselves began to shift in his favor, bending quietly to the gravity he exerted. Policies that once protected integrity were reinterpreted, rewritten, or quietly ignored. Teams fractured in ways no one could explain, as if the system itself had developed a mind of its own, recalibrating to accommodate him. The machinery she had studied in texts, suppressed and dismissed by the world, was alive, and he was at its center. She watched the subtle corruption unfold, piece by piece. Resources were redirected to support initiatives that reinforced his influence. Decisions were justified retroactively, as if logic itself had been rewritten to accommodate his narrative. Leaders who might have opposed him were quietly sidelined, not by confrontation, but by the quiet erosion of authority. And in this silence, power solidified. The terrifying realization hit her. It wasn't just the people immediately around him who were affected. Systems, policies, reputations, all were being silently reshaped, without anyone realizing the architect behind the transformation. It was the kind of corruption that cannot be traced in reports, minutes, or audits. It is the kind that leaves no evidence because it operates in perception, in expectation, in compliance before conscious thought. She also noticed how the world outside the immediate environment seemed complicit. Outsiders interpreted the chaos as inefficiency, chance, or incompetence, never considering that it was carefully engineered. That was the genius of his approach. The ripple effects were undeniable, but their source invisible. And she began to see a deeper truth. Men like him do not need armies. They need networks of unknowing, a society conditioned to ignore the subtle and accept the convenient. Every oversight, every rationalization, every distracted glance became a brick in the foundation of his power. And because no one questioned these small compromises, the system became his instrument. She felt the weight of it, the inevitability. History had already provided the template. Silent corruption, unchallenged influence, systems bending around the subtle pull of one individual. And now, she was witnessing it firsthand. She understood that warning people was no longer enough. Awareness was vital, but without action, without the courage to disrupt the machinery, it was meaningless. And most people, she knew, would choose the comfort of ignorance over the peril of truth. Witnessing his influence was like standing in a room filled with invisible currents, feeling the pressure of a force no one else acknowledged. She felt it in every interaction, every meeting, every casual glance. It was exhausting, disorienting, and terrifying. People who had no awareness of his control were navigating a landscape she could see clearly, and that clarity was both a gift and a curse. The psychological toll was immense. She began to notice herself questioning her instincts, doubting her own perceptions. It's a cruel trick. The closer you get to understanding someone like him, the more your mind tests itself, asking, am I seeing this accurately? Or is my fear making it real? Every prediction, every observation, became a balancing act. One misstep, one underestimation, and the machinery he had constructed could crush not only others, but her. She saw the same pattern repeat in those who tried to resist him. The stronger the resistance, the heavier the weight. People who refused to bend began to fracture internally. Stress, anxiety, and self-doubt became tools he wielded without effort. They isolated themselves, alienated allies, and became exhausted trying to convince others of something no one else wanted to see. Resistance without understanding is a lonely, punishing path. And yet, she understood a fundamental truth. Awareness alone is not enough to survive him. Knowledge is critical, yes, but so is discipline, patience, and the capacity to anticipate without reacting. The mind of someone like him moves in a rhythm most cannot perceive. To confront it directly is to step into a storm you cannot control. She began recording everything, not only to preserve the patterns for others, but to maintain her own anchor. Observation became a form of survival. Every gesture, every reaction, every ripple of influence was catalogued. It was exhausting, but necessary. She could not allow herself to be manipulated. Not like the others. Not even partially. And through it all, she felt a cold, persistent truth. Those who witness power like this, silent, total, invisible, are changed. Not physically, not obviously, but internally. Your understanding of the world, of human behavior, of morality, begins to shift. You see what others refuse to see. You know the machinery, and that knowledge carries weight, one that cannot be shrugged off. Because once you've seen it, you cannot unsee it. And now we reach the tipping point. The moment where invisible influence becomes undeniable reality. She had been watching him, documenting him, warning others who refused to hear, and now the machinery he had built began to accelerate. Fractures multiplied. Decisions no longer reflected independent thought. They mirrored the subtle pressure of his will. Even the strongest resisted only partially. The rest followed blindly. This is the moment most people never recognize until it's too late. The transformation of free thought into managed perception. Choices made under his influence feel voluntary, natural, even moral, but they are designed. Every hesitation he exploits, every insecurity he amplifies, every doubt he implants moves people closer to submission without resistance. The web spreads silently, invisibly, yet its grip is total. She understood something that most never will. Those who resist become dangerous not to him, but to themselves. The pressure of awareness is relentless. Watching the machinery unfold, knowing what is happening, feeling powerless to stop it, it erodes the mind. And she knew that without a way to anchor herself, she too could fall prey to the subtle, invisible manipulation that had consumed so many. That is why she devised a method to maintain clarity, a symbolic act to cement awareness and identity. And now, I want you to do the same. If you are listening closely, if you are willing to see what most cannot, I want you to write in the comments the phrase, "I see the machine." Write it twice. Not once, twice. This is not a game. This is a ritual, a symbolic act to declare that you recognize the invisible currents around you, and that you are awake to the forces shaping the world. Do it now. Twice. Let it anchor you. Let it mark the moment you choose awareness over ignorance. Because awareness is the first, and often the only, step toward survival. She had warned them. They ignored her. But you are listening. You have a choice that they never took. By acknowledging the truth, by engaging with it, by symbolically claiming your awareness, you step into a new reality. One where you cannot be unknowingly manipulated. One where perception, identity, and thought are yours to defend. This is the first act of resistance. The first step in walking through the shadows unafraid. And if you've done it correctly, you are no longer just a witness. You are awake. Those who fail to awaken are easy prey. Oblivious, compliant, and utterly convinced of their own autonomy, they walk into the machinery without resistance. The subtle pressure, the invisible currents, and the quiet manipulations bend them slowly, invisibly, until they are extensions of the system they never realized existed. And by the time they notice, they are already trapped, caught in a web of influence so complete that disentangling themselves becomes impossible. She had watched it happen countless times. Men who believed they were making independent choices discovered that every action they took, every word they spoke, every alignment they thought was voluntary, had been influenced. The realization didn't come gently. It came as confusion, disillusionment, and finally despair. They could see the manipulation only after their autonomy had been eroded beyond repair. And therein lies the cruelty. People rarely resist until the pressure is unbearable. By then, the system has already reshaped them. Careers, reputations, relationships, everything can be rewritten, redefined, reproposed. They become instruments of the very influence they sought to avoid. And yet, the worst betrayal is internal. They begin to doubt themselves, their instincts, their judgment. The machine does not need to destroy them externally. It destroys them from within. She understood this better than anyone. Awareness was not optional. Vigilance was survival. And yet, even she recognized that knowledge comes at a cost. The clarity that allowed her to see him also made her vulnerable to isolation, skepticism, and relentless pressure. Being awake is not safe. It is not comfortable. It is not acknowledged by the unseeing masses. But the alternative, ignorance, is far worse. Because the world does not pause for those who refuse to recognize the currents beneath their feet. Systems, institutions, even social structures, once infiltrated, adapt and perpetuate the influence silently. It becomes a force so integrated that attempts to resist without understanding it are often fatal, socially, professionally, or psychologically. She had warned them. They had refused to listen, and in their compliance, they became the proof of his method. The mechanism of his control revealed in human form, obedient, rationalizing, unaware, yet utterly complicit. And that is why you must not ignore what you now know. Because awareness is not just knowledge, it is a weapon, a shield, a way to survive the invisible forces most will never see. Power, in its purest form, is not loud. It does not shout, threaten, or announce itself. It moves quietly, like a shadow drifting beneath the surface of ordinary life. That is how he operated, never directly, never visibly, never in a way that could be traced or contested. And yet, piece by piece, he consolidated control in ways that no one else could perceive. Not because they were foolish, but because they were conditioned to see only what they were told to see. He mastered the art of concealed influence. Ideas that originated from him would appear in the mouths of others weeks later, as if they were spontaneous insights. Decisions were framed as collective choices, even though the true source was always the silent gravity of his presence. When people acted in ways that benefited him, they sincerely believed they were following their own instincts. That was his brilliance. He planted direction inside them without touching their will. To the untrained eye, nothing seemed out of place. Meetings continued. Deadlines were met. Projects moved forward. Yet beneath the surface, the center of gravity had shifted. People who once challenged authority now deferred instinctively. Individuals who once questioned everything now analyzed nothing. The environment had been recalibrated without anyone noticing the moment it began. And he kept himself clean. No fingerprints, no direct commands, no statements that could expose his intent. His influence moved through subtle cues. A look, a pause, a withheld reaction. He weaponized ambiguity. When people didn't know what he was thinking, they filled the silence with their assumptions, their fears, their insecurities. And those assumptions guided their actions more effectively than any command he could have given. She marveled at the precision of it. This wasn't amateur manipulation. This was architecture, psychological engineering crafted with centuries of precedent behind it. He wasn't merely influencing individuals. He was tuning the collective behavior of an entire system. Those who tried to expose him found nothing concrete. No evidence. No confession. Only their own unraveling credibility. That's how he protected himself, by letting others destroy themselves in the act of trying to reveal him. A trap built from perception, not force. A structure sustained by silence, not violence. Most people never realized they were already inside his design. But she did. And that knowledge made it dangerous, to him and to herself. Because once you see the architecture, you cannot remain a passive observer. You are forced to choose, adapt to it, or attempt to break it. And breaking it would require a level of clarity and ruthlessness that few possess. She had always believed men like him were rare, outliers, anomalies, singular forces of manipulation and control. But the deeper she studied him, the more she recognized the unsettling truth. He wasn't an exception. He was an expression, a modern iteration of an ancient pattern. And once she understood that pattern, everything changed. Because throughout history, there have always been individuals whose power flowed not from brute strength or social status, but from something far older, an intuitive understanding of human weakness. These figures appeared in every civilization, every empire, every institution. Men who could tilt the axis of entire cultures without raising their voice. Men who could bend the loyalty of nations with nothing more than presence, perception, and timing. They were never recorded accurately. They never left journals, manifestos, or confessions. They operated in the margins of history, shaping kings, priests, generals, and governments from behind the curtain. Their fingerprints are visible only in the sudden shifts that history books cannot explain. When she studied him, she saw the same blueprint, the same quiet dominance, the same gravity that draws people inward without their awareness. He was not new. He was the next iteration, a refinement. The origin pattern she discovered was not about bloodlines or secret societies. It was psychological, behavioral, evolutionary. The world had always produced these figures, but modern society masked them under roles and titles that made their tactics look ordinary. In truth, they were anything but ordinary. They were specialists in the unseen, architects of influence, engineers of collective behavior. And the more she mapped the pattern, the more she realized its danger. Because every iteration learns from the failures of the ones before it. Each generation refines the silent methods, becoming harder to detect, harder to oppose, harder to expose. He was simply the most advanced version she had ever seen. Not because of intelligence, but because of timing. He had entered a world so distracted, so fractured, so overstimulated, that his subtlety became a superweapon. No one was paying enough attention to notice the quiet shifts. No one cared to question their own perceptions. And no one imagined that one person could manipulate systems without ever being seen doing it. But she saw it. And she saw something else, something that chilled her deeper than anything before. If the pattern was this old, if it had thrived across centuries, Then he wasn't the end of it. He was the opening move, a precursor to a much larger cycle, a cycle already unfolding. And she knew that if she didn't uncover the full scope of it soon, the system he was constructing wouldn't just shape decisions or behavior. It would rewrite identity. Permanently. The deeper she went, the more she realized that his influence wasn't just psychological. It was structural. It wasn't merely how he affected people, but how he reconfigured them. The changes he induced were not momentary fluctuations in mood or confidence. They were lasting, foundational, irreversible in ways that terrified her. She began to notice something consistent among those closest to him. They did not simply comply. They became different people. Their priorities changed. Their values drifted. Their emotional responses dulled or sharpened in ways that mirrored his own internal logic. It was as if proximity to him rewired their inner architecture. Not forcibly, not consciously, but inevitably. And she found the mechanism, hidden in plain sight, disguised as ordinary human behavior. It was simple, subtle, and devastating. He manipulated people by controlling what they paid attention to. Attention is the gatekeeper of identity. Where the mind focuses, the self follows. He didn't change people by persuading them. He changed them by redirecting their focus, subtly, consistently, relentlessly. He drew their attention toward insecurity, uncertainty, dependency, ambiguity, and away from autonomy, awareness, and self-definition. Over time, this shift reshaped their internal world, their thoughts, their emotional patterns, their perception of themselves. People think identity is stable. It isn't. Identity is the sum of what your mind returns to repeatedly. And he controlled that repetition with frightening precision. She watched as individuals slowly aligned themselves with his worldview. Not because he convinced them, but because he curated their attention. He allowed them to see what benefited him, and subtly obscured everything that didn't. They internalized this without ever realizing it. The transformation felt natural, earned, even righteous. That's how he created loyalty. Not devotion, not admiration, but alignment. The kind of alignment that feels like personal conviction, even when it's engineered from the outside. And that was the chilling part. Once someone's internal compass recalibrates around an external force, there's no turning back. The old identity dissolves. A new one emerges. Engineered, constructed, owned. She realized that this was not influence. It was assimilation. Not in the science fiction sense, but in the psychological one. A quiet absorption of autonomy. A subtle erasure of self-direction. A transformation so complete that the subject believes it was their idea all along. This was the deeper mechanism. The one no one saw until they were already consumed by it. And she knew then, beyond all doubt, if she didn't understand how to counter this mechanism soon, she would lose herself too. Not through force, but through the slow, silent surrender of her attention. Because once he occupies your focus, he occupies your identity. And once he occupies your identity, the battle is already over. Resisting him was not like resisting an ordinary person. She quickly realized that conventional strategies, arguments, confrontation, or exposure, were ineffective. He did not operate on the level of information, position, or authority. He operated on the level of perception itself. To challenge him directly was to step into a storm where the rules of engagement were invisible, where the battlefield existed inside the minds of everyone around her. And yet, she could not remain passive. She began experimenting, cautiously, meticulously, looking for cracks in the pattern he had imposed. She tested attention, timing, and subtle cues, mirroring his methods not to imitate him, but to defend against him. It was exhausting, almost unbearable, because every misstep had consequences. One wrong observation, one mistimed intervention, and she risked becoming part of the machinery herself. The first attempts were small victories, almost imperceptible. A colleague who had been subtly aligned with him reconsidered a decision, quietly, in private. A conversation redirected, attention shifted, and for a fleeting moment, autonomy flickered back. She understood the mechanism now. Interrupt the flow of attention. Break the patterns. Introduce clarity where ambiguity had taken root. But these were temporary measures. Temporary pockets of resistance in an environment engineered to nullify them. And the cost of resisting became painfully clear. Isolation, scrutiny, and distrust intensified. Allies disappeared, not because they were opposed, but because the pressure of proximity made them unwilling to risk engagement. Even the act of observing, documenting, and intervening became dangerous. Exposure, once subtle, could lead to retaliation, not overt, but in forms designed to discredit, destabilize, and consume. She understood then the paradox of resisting someone like him. Survival requires awareness, but awareness itself marks you as a target. She also realized that fighting him required more than intelligence. It required discipline, patience, and a capacity for subtlety she had not anticipated. Every move had to be calculated with precision. Every intervention weighed against the likelihood of creating new vulnerabilities. Resistance was a long game, years, not days. A war waged quietly inside minds, across networks, and through the invisible architecture of influence. And yet, she persisted, because inaction was far worse. The alternative was not safety, not neutrality, but slow, complete assimilation. And she had seen too many people, too many brilliant minds, too many confident souls, fold into the pattern without ever realizing it, consumed by it, redefined by it, lost forever. She knew now that resisting him came at a terrible price. But the cost of surrender was absolute. The first irreversible consequences of resistance arrived silently, almost invisibly. They were not confrontations, not scandals, not dramatic showdowns. They were fractures within her own life, relationships stretched thin, trust eroded, support networks quietly withdrawn. People she had relied on for years began to look at her with suspicion, uncertainty, even fear. Not because she had done anything wrong, but because proximity to her resistance threatened the fragile equilibrium they had unconsciously embraced under his influence. She felt it in her wake, her social interactions, her every decision. A colleague would hesitate to share information, not out of malice, but out of instinctive self-preservation. Allies became cautious, defensive, distant. Even the smallest action, a word spoken, a glance, could ripple through the network of influence he had constructed, creating consequences she could neither predict nor control. Resistance came at the cost of solitude, and solitude sharpened the awareness she could not afford to dull. The isolation was psychological as much as practical. With each act of defiance, her clarity made her a target not for aggression, but for erasure. People began to doubt her credibility, questioning her motives in ways subtle enough to avoid confrontation but sharp enough to wound. The machinery he had built was designed to punish without appearing to do so. And the more she resisted, the more precise and insidious the countermeasures became. She also realized the deeper cost. Her own mind was under siege. The constant vigilance, the mental mapping of patterns, the attention to the invisible levers he pulled. It was exhausting. Awareness itself demanded energy, focus, and an unflinching psychological resilience that few could sustain. Any lapse, even brief, risked absorption into the very patterns she was resisting. Every day was a battle to maintain identity, clarity, and autonomy. And yet, the stakes left her no choice. She had seen what happened to those who ignored the warning signs. People who surrendered their attention surrendered themselves. Lives, careers, moral compasses, all quietly restructured without their knowledge. She could not allow herself to become another casualty, another silent instrument in his network. Resisting him was painful. Resisting him was dangerous. Resisting him could cost everything. But surrender would cost all of who she was. The system itself began to bend under his subtle gravity. It was no longer just individuals being reshaped. Entire processes, entire institutions, entire hierarchies were quietly relining around him. Policies were interpreted to favor outcomes he preferred. Priorities shifted without formal directives, and accountability dissolved into ambiguity. To an outsider, everything appeared ordinary, functional even. But beneath the surface, the architecture of control was solidifying, self-reinforcing, and invisible to all who weren't attuned to it. She saw it everywhere. Teams that once operated on clear principles now deferred instinctively to his judgment, even when he said nothing. Projects stalled not because of incompetence, but because the environment had been engineered so that resistance felt irrational, unproductive, or unsafe. Decisions that should have reflected collective reasoning now mirrored the unspoken expectations he had planted long before. The system had become a living organism, breathing and moving according to his will. And the most terrifying aspect was its self-sufficiency. He didn't need to push. He didn't need to intervene. People were already acting in ways that maintained and expanded his influence without his explicit direction. Subtle approval, quiet observation, and the mere presence of his attention was sufficient to enforce compliance. Those who might have opposed him either adapted or quietly withdrew, often blaming themselves rather than recognizing the invisible hand shaping their choices. She recognized the pattern from historical accounts, from suppressed case studies. Power like this doesn't announce itself. It consolidates silently, becoming both unstoppable and invisible. Those who attempt to expose it are discredited or exhausted before the system can even be challenged. And those who remain unaware become part of the mechanism itself, perpetuating his influence without conscious consent. She understood then that the consequences were no longer hypothetical. They were structural. Entire institutions could be reshaped, values subverted, and outcomes controlled, all without a single overt act. And when such a system begins to operate on autopilot, disentangling it becomes almost impossible. Resistance, even when visible, has a cost so steep that few are willing to pay it. He had transcended the need for coercion or force. His power was now embedded in the very architecture of the system, and the world was rearranging itself quietly, invisibly, around him. And she realized the truth that chilled her more than anything else. This was only the beginning. The personal cost of maintaining resistance became relentless. Every day was a battle to keep her mind untainted, her perception sharp, and her attention anchored. The more she saw, the subtleties of his influence, the fractures in human behavior, the invisible recalibration of entire systems, the heavier the burden grew. Awareness alone was not enough. It demanded vigilance, discipline, and a clarity few could sustain without fracturing under pressure. Isolation intensified. Allies disappeared quietly, not because they opposed her, but because proximity to resistance made them uneasy. The act of observing, analyzing, and countering his methods created distance between her and everyone else. Conversations that once felt natural became exercises in mental armor. Every word had to be weighed, every gesture scrutinized, every interaction calibrated to maintain autonomy while preserving a semblance of normalcy. And yet, the fatigue was insidious. It attacked the mind in ways that were almost imperceptible. Subtle doubt, creeping anxiety, fleeting lapses in focus, these were the weapons of his system, whether intentionally directed at her or as a byproduct of the environment he had engineered. The constant vigilance demanded by resistance began to consume energy, erode patience, and create a gnawing tension that never fully subsided. She also realized the paradox. The more clearly she understood the system, the more exposed she became. Awareness marked her as different, as perceptive, as someone capable of seeing the invisible forces that everyone else ignored. And in that difference, she became a target, socially, psychologically, and professionally. The cost of insight was isolation, the cost of clarity was exhaustion, and the cost of vigilance was the constant fear that one misstep could be enough to tip the balance in his favor. Yet surrender was unthinkable. To give in, even partially, was to accept the dissolution of identity, autonomy, and agency. She had witnessed too many others fold quietly into the system, reshaped without realizing it, consumed without resistance. She could not allow herself to become one of them. So she endured. She observed. She resisted. And she understood a truth that few could survive acknowledging. Resistance is never safe. It is never easy. It is a constant negotiation with fatigue, fear, and isolation. But surrender is death of the self. By now, the full extent of his reach became undeniable. She could trace it in the decisions of teams, the patterns of alliances, the silent acquiescence of those who once would have challenged him. His influence was no longer just interpersonal. It had become structural, systemic, and self-perpetuating. Entire organizations moved in ways that reflected his will without his intervention, as if the machinery itself had absorbed his presence and replicated it independently. The terrifying truth hit her with cold clarity. Most people would never see this. They would only feel its consequences, missed opportunities, fractured relationships, stalled careers, internal doubt, and never recognize the architect behind it. And that invisibility was his ultimate weapon. He did not need to enforce loyalty or obedience. He only needed to remain unseen while the world reshaped itself around his gravity. She also understood why previous warnings had been ignored. People resist the idea that one individual can exert such pervasive control without overt action. They need noise, confrontation, proof, spectacle. And he offered none. The subtleties of his manipulation were invisible to those untrained in perception, and by the time the consequences became apparent, they were irreversible. Her own position remained perilous. Resistance required vigilance, insight, and courage in equal measure. Any lapse could be exploited. Any moment of distraction could tip her into the same silent assimilation she had witnessed in others. And yet, the alternative, inaction, was far worse. Compliance meant surrender. Silence meant erasure. Ignorance meant being absorbed into a system whose endgame was invisibly predetermined. And in that recognition, she realized the final, horrifying truth. This was not a battle of action, but of awareness. To survive, to maintain autonomy, she would have to outlast the machinery of influence itself. She would have to think, perceive, and act with precision that mirrored his own. Every observation became a strategy, every interaction a test, every silence a shield. Those who ignored him were lost. Those who opposed him openly were crushed. Those who understood him, and acted carefully, had the only chance of survival. And the cost of that understanding? Everything. Because awareness of this force changes a man, or a woman, forever. Once you see the invisible, you can never unsee it. And once you recognize the architecture of control, you can never step into the world as though it does not exist. The question is no longer whether you will resist. The question is whether you can survive the knowledge of what resisting truly demands. This is where the descent ends, and where the truth burns brightest. She had followed the threads of influence, mapped the invisible currents, and witnessed the transformation of minds, systems, and identities. She had seen the consequences for those who surrendered, for those who resisted poorly, for those who remained blind. And now she understood the final, most horrifying reality. There is no escape from the architecture of influence once it has embedded itself, but there is survival, if you choose awareness over compliance. He will never announce himself. He will never declare his intent. He will remain calm, silent, even benign in appearance. And yet, every decision, every hesitation, every instinct you rely on will be subtly reshaped if you let it. Resistance is not a confrontation. It is a constant recalibration, a perpetual observation, a vigilance that can never rest. The stakes are not optional. They are total. Those who ignore the signs, who dismiss the subtle manipulations, the invisible pressures, the quiet erosion of autonomy, become instruments of his will. They are not aware of it, yet they act to expand the system, enforce the pattern, and maintain the machinery without realizing they are doing so. The tragedy is not just in their loss, but in their complicity. For you, watching this, the choice is real. You have seen the patterns, recognized the tactics, glimpsed the structure behind the chaos. You have been given what so many never receive, awareness. But awareness carries responsibility. It requires action, not in the overt, dramatic sense, but in the disciplined, relentless shaping of perception, attention, and focus. Every thought, every decision, every alignment must be measured against the architecture you now understand exists. Once you understand this, you cannot return to ignorance. You cannot unsee the machine, nor the way it bends human behavior, nor the subtle erosion of identity that occurs under its influence. But this knowledge is your weapon, your shield, your chance to survive when others fall. She warned them. They did not listen. They became invisible casualties in a war they never knew existed. You are listening. You have chosen differently. And now, the final truth. The world is quietly shaped by forces most will never perceive. Power is never as it appears. Influence is never as it seems. Freedom, for those who do not guard it, is an illusion. You have the knowledge. You have the awareness. What you do with it will define whether you are a survivor or another silent instrument in the machine. The choice is yours.